the children come for a play date so that we can see that they are meeting normal developmental milestones, I think I would say. Entrance into reception is a little bit more selective. I suppose you have to, and we'll probably talk about that in a few questions' time, you have to be honest about the school that you're running and about the school, about the sort of children who are going to thrive and do really well there. So when we assess children for entry into reception, we're looking a little bit about their language, their spoken language, their received language, looking at how they respond as part of a group, looking at how they respond to adults who aren't their mums and dads. And we're making a judgment, and we will also then receive really precious and valuable references from nurseries that children have been to. And that matters a lot to us, so that we kind of, in a sense, we sort of triangulate, if you like, from evidence from the nurseries, what we see on the day itself, and what the parents really want for the school, and that's how we assess children coming into reception.
Wow. Okay, so already, okay, I'm going to ask a question here. Who went to school themselves in London? One or two people. Okay, if you didn't go to school in London, that answer is almost unheard of.
I know.
Outside of London, schools do not do this. I mean, anywhere. So this is telling you something about what London is like. If you're not from London and you didn't know it before, you're starting to discover it, which is that London schools can be very choosy in a way that schools outside London aren't. And that's part of what this show is about, is trying to explain to parents what London schools are like, because they are different, aren't they?
They're really different, and what I said a few sentences ago, I think, is when you're thinking about this beginning of the journey for your children, I think what is so important is that you, in a sense, that you've decided what sort of school you want for your child, and you look carefully about what these schools claim for themselves. Are they claiming that they are mixed ability, or are they claiming that there is some form of academic selection? Are they saying that they are, I mean, there are schools, and mine would be one of those, that would say we are unashamedly academically ambitious. Others would say, do you know what, that's not our bag at all. We are very broad in our intake, and that's who we are. So I think that is a consideration when you start thinking about schools. What vibe is it that you want for your children? You know, I think that is part of the picture.
And I think nurseries will help you with that decision as well. So a big part of what I do for my parents is to try and advise them on which angle to take, because, as Alison says, you've got to be mindful of if your child is going to fit into the environment, the ethos of the school, and as a family, as a whole. And that's something that I very much advise and help parents with.
And I guess in a way, the thing to be aware of is that part of the reason that the prep schools are being like this is because at senior school level, it's even more like that. So the big well-known schools in London that you've all heard of, your St Paul's or Westminsters or your Highgates or City of Londons, these are really, really competitive institutions, which again is different from outside London. There are one or two places in the country like Manchester Grammar or so on where the schools are very, very competitive. But in a lot of parts of the country, basically if you could pay the fees, you can more or less go. They're fairly mixed ability schools. That isn't the case in London. And so school heads like Alison's reputation is on getting kids into the good schools. And so they have to try and find the children who will get into those schools. I mean, that's what's going on, isn't it?
I think it is. I think also what I wouldn't want to do is to spook you into thinking that at age 4 these children have got to look like they're going to be sort of Mensa members. That is absolutely not the case at all. And the piece in all of this, in the spirit of honesty, as we're all sitting here with our headphones on, is that, of course, the piece of information that we can't ever capture is we don't know how many schools that you're applying to. So I can look at the loads of families who are applying to Newton Prep and think, wow, that's absolutely loads. But of course, they will also be families will also be applying to maybe 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 other prep schools. And the piece of information I can't get hold of, which of course is the piece of information I'd love, is the families who really want Newton Prep as their school of first choice. because they're the families I would give the offers to. Because if they love what they see and it aligns with what the family want, it's going to work great. So that's really what, I guess, for me, what I'm looking for. It's not hard data. It's, does this feel from this family that what we offer, that there feels that there's going to be a really good alignment with your hopes for your child and what we think we could offer. Because what you don't want to do is turn up to a school and think, God, this isn't what I wanted at all. You want to make sure that it resonates with what you want for your children, I think.
I'm really tempted to ask you the numbers question there. You don't have to answer this. Roughly how many applicants to places? Ratio, maybe?
See, that's a horrible question because the answer is scary, in a sense. So I suppose typically it's going to be something like 3 children for every 1 place. But when the whole thing settles down,
yeah,
there is a whole the tectonic plates are moving all the time. So I make my offers and think great, and then actually they go off somewhere else. How very dare they? But they can go off to another school. And so, that's the bit. So, yes, we're oversubscribed as you are. But you have to, if you're going to come to a London school, you have to apply to more than 1 school, because that's just the nature of the beast. And at the end of the day, you can only accept 1 offer. So we are, and I don't expect any sympathy, of course, but we are sort of also in a situation where it's quite hard to call exactly who's going to accept our offers. So yes, we're oversubscribed. Yes, there are more children than we've got places. But I don't think that should put you off in the slightest because of the moving tectonic plates.
And I think as well in London, I'm sure Alison finds it at Neat and Prep, that because London is so transient, people do move. Even if you don't get your place offered immediately, there's a waiting list, and we very often will go to the waiting list and offer places. It might be a game of nerves and it might be a bit last minute, but there is always movement. So it's always worth trying.
There's a wonderful bit of advice too that I know one head gives parents when they're looking at senior schools, which is just that actually in September every child is in school. Like, there aren't children wandering the streets, not in a school. So it's, although the system seems completely crazy and completely competitive and you're not going to get in somewhere, actually you are, and it's probably going to be all right. And you just have to kind of slightly trust the system and trust yourself that it is going to be okay. But you can get quite caught up in the kind of madness of the process beforehand. So on that front, I'm going to ask Lucinda, because you professionally advise parents about this very knotty problem. If you're not in a nursery like yours and you haven't got a you professionally advising you, how do you work out that your 2-year-old would suit a school like Alison's versus another kind of school? What do you do as a parent because obviously we all think our children are marvellous, and
I think every parent, your children best, and I think you very quickly, when you go around to these schools, you'll get a feeling, and I always say to parents, like buying a house, you walk into a school and you think, actually this is perfect for my child, for my family, and I think that's why I always advise parents to go and look at many different schools, state schools, big schools, small schools, as many as you can, to get a feel for what's out there, because they are all a little bit different, and I think you will quickly get an idea for what you feel is right for you and your family.
What about the kind of developmental stuff? I mean, like, what are the signals that you ought to be looking out for in terms of deciding whether a child should go down a competitive route or not?
Again, I would seek advice from the nursery. I think it's difficult if your child is not in a nursery and goes straight to school, because then you have no idea really. Obviously, you're relying on a parent's point of view. But I think from our experience, we can quite quickly see children who perhaps would suit a more academic setting. And as Alison said, we write references for the children, and most nurseries, I think you asked probably, most nurseries do write references because we know them best. So we are able to sort of, and I'm quite honest with my parents, and if they've got their heart set on a really academic school that I know the selection process is very hard, I will say, actually, I think maybe it's not the right decision, not the right choice, and maybe apply for a slightly different school. So again, that's where you say there's a right school, a right fit.
If parents are worried about development issues like speech and language delay, for example, what should they do about it? Should they go and get tests, or? So
we, it's something, every child will have a 2-year review, one done with the health visitor for the health and one done with the nursery for the education side. And that is the time that we would speak to parents and flag up if we had any concerns. And then it's just monitoring. Very often children, some children will be speaking perfectly by 2, some won't speak till they're nearly 3. It's a stage, it's not an age. And I think, as a parent myself, I think, my child his speech was delayed, and you think it's never going to happen, you think you're the only one, but I think the more you talk to parents and the more you find out from other people, actually, particularly now, there's so much more out there, more resources, more support for parents who've got children who perhaps aren't meeting those developmental milestones. But I would say to seek advice from the GP as well. They will be able to tell if you're eligible for the speech and language on the NHS, or you can go down the private route and get private speech and language as well.
I mean, it's interesting, speech and language, my son has speech and language delay. He was adopted from the care system, and it was a really good indicator of issues. On the other hand, an awful lot of London families are multilingual, and multilingual families, again, speech and language delay is quite common in that scenario, isn't it? So.
Yes, and we have, as most London schools, will have many children who are bi or trilingual. And my understanding of, broadly speaking, the research is that often children who have got more than one language buzzing around in their brain, up until they're about age 9, it's quite difficult for their brains to separate that out. It's often a bit of a mashup. By about age 9, their brain does better at separating out, so you don't get this weird sort of combination of languages that you get when they're little. So we are it's not just accepting, I think, isn't it amazing that children are going to grow up in this world bi or trilingual? Aren't they lucky? So for me, I regard that as the most incredible thing, that they are handling more than one language. And I think, I think that's really important. And I think the other thing is that we know that developmentally, with such very young children, for instance, a September-born girl versus an August-born boy, just developmentally, it's kind of chalk and cheese, and I say that as a mum of summer-born boys. It's a very different setup. But we accept, we completely accept that when we see these children, that there will be a developmental maturation issue as much as anything, but it's not anything to do with their academic potential. It's just where they are at that very, very early stage in their life. So I think for all of us with such young children, the more than one language, the fact where they are positioned in the school year, that all matters. And so any of our selection process, it's not hard data here. They're not being asked to sit and do an exam. It's trying to look at a whole piece and say, does it look like this child will fit in at this school? But we'll have children who've got limited English, and that is absolutely fine too.
So I'm going to ask Alison one more question. While I'm doing that, start mulling over. You've got a great pair of speakers here to quiz about what you might want, about the things you want to know about. So start thinking about questions you might like to ask. But while you're thinking, I'm just going to ask Alison a follow-up question to that last bit, which is really about special education needs and at what point. I mean, a lot of those things start to manifest a little bit later, don't they? But are there any needs that kind of start bubbling up before school?
Yes, and I mean, obviously, as soon as they come to school, whether it's in nursery or reception, just as Lucinda said, we're looking all the time, really. And teachers, when we talk in the world of education, and those of you may or may not know this, but there's this notion of summative assessment, which when you were at school would have been like school tests and exams. And then there's what's called formative assessment, where you're forming a view, looking at the child, looking at how they're functioning in the classroom. And with such young children, formative assessment is hugely important. So if we start seeing what I describe as a bit of clear water opening up between this child and everybody else, then we would certainly start looking more carefully, start looking at whether they need interventions of some sort, so a little bit of one-on-one help. And then it would be over time that we might think, well, do you know what? Maybe it would be really helpful if we had a speech and language therapist or an educational an educational psychologist to have a look at the child. But it wouldn't be something you wouldn't bounce from a nursery child or a reception child straight to an ed psych report. I mean, that's some way down the road. Because as I say, not all, but a lot of those things are about maturation and age and stage of development. It isn't that there is some major cognitive issue. There might be. And then schools like ours and even nurseries like Lucinda's, then it's something that you start looking at as the evidence becomes more apparent, I guess I'd say.
Okay, so would anyone like to kick off and ask a question?
Thank you very much. So for parents making decisions for those early stages, how far ahead do you advise we think about these things? So are we kind of going, I want him to be somewhere when he's 20 and then I need to work my way back? Or do we go, okay, he's 4, so let's sort him out for 4 and then let's sort out the later stages and then the school changes doesn't matter as much later on?
I think that's a really good question. So I think, again, I suppose the significant things you would have to factor in is if you sent your child to a prep school that, say, finished at age 7 or age 8, so one of the pre-preps, then you are accepting that they've got to be ready to move on at that stage. So I think that's important. You might want to choose a school that where all the kids leave at age 11, and so that's got to be, they've got to be primed and ready to go off at age 11. Or you might choose a prep school that goes up to 13, because then that means all the boarding schools that are on the table, the London day schools that don't take kids till 13. So I do think, whilst you can't possibly know if your 3-year-old is St Paul's bound, you know, you can't possibly know that. It probably is an important consideration to think about whether the school, how many options going forward are left on the table, I guess is what I would say. But with such little children, you can't possibly be thinking, or you can dream, but you can't possibly know what sort of senior schools they're going to. But it is all of us, and we have to do this on our websites. It's one of these things that you have to do by sort of regs, is all of us have got our destination schools on the website. So you can go on and say, okay, all of those kids seem to go boarding. We're not a boarding family. That is never going to be on the cards for us. Or you could say all of their children seem to go to day schools, but you know what? A boarding school could be on the cards for us. So I guess it's worth looking at so it is worth just looking on the website and saying what sort of schools do their children go to then, to see if it sort of aligns with a fair wind and the stars in alignment where you hope that your children might go when it comes to it, you know?
Thank you. I was interested in your interests, where I believe, Alison, you said that you came from a state school background, but then your children have gone on the independent route in secondary school, and I believe it was the opposite with Lucinda. So I wonder, what played on your minds? What considerations did you have when you were making those decisions?
So, can I kick off? So with my own children, because I was state educated, I always believed that's what they would do. I never, and I still, I realise it's a little late in the day now, but I still sometimes slightly think, how did this happen? I'm not quite sure how I've ended up in the independent sector. I thought it would be state all the way. And I suppose what changed things for me, my oldest son, I thought he was probably quite a bright boy, and he was in a reception class of 32 children, and I just began to think, yoicks, I'm just a bit worried about this. I'm worried that maybe there isn't enough of that challenge for him. And it nearly was the death of my marriage, I have to say, because my husband was very much, I didn't think we moved to this new house for us to suddenly now do private school. You know, it wasn't what he planned either. So I guess it was a sort of with reluctance. And if I really step outside of the parameters of this panel at this show here this evening, I wish it wasn't this way. I wish every child in the country had the wonderful experiences that children in the independent sector have. And it feels very sad to me that they don't. And the political point I would make is, what a shame the present government didn't look at why the independent sector is so successful. Why? Why are they so good? It isn't just because parents have got money, and it isn't because all the children are bright, because they're not. But why do we do so well? And that would have been such a good discussion to have had, rather than slam the VAT on and try and make it really very sort of extraordinarily expensive for people. So it wasn't, it was, I guess it was pragmatism that my kids turned up at a state primary school, and I just thought, yoicks, I think that this is lacking a bit of challenge here.
So I had sort of the opposite in that my son had speech delay, and I didn't want to go through the 4+ assessment with him. And we have a very good state school where we lived, so we chose that and were very happy with it. And then my daughter followed because it was an excellent school. And then we, again, with the added cost of VAT, we decided to keep going with the state. And we also have very good state schools near where we live, so that's why we did it. And I think looking at the education that my son is receiving in his secondary versus mine, I suppose the only drawback for me, as Alison said, would be the class sizes. There's a lot in a class, but he's thriving there. So yeah, it's going well so far.
A lot depends on where you live, I think, doesn't it?
Yes.
Thank you. One question I have is, how do you think the difference is between a nursery that is connected to a school or a nursery that is independent?
We're quite conflicted here because there is a nursery class in Alison's school, and we are obviously just a nursery. And I suppose I would say the benefits of choosing a nursery school like ours is that they get the full experience over 2 years. So they start with us at 2, and then they get to be top of their tree and the eldest. And it's lovely to see the progression and their confidence, and I sort of then feel that they're really ready for reception and ready for that move. All we do is nursery as well, so that's our passion, and that's everything that we are as a school. So I would say that that's probably the main advantages of the school.
And actually, I don't disagree with you, actually, Lucinda, in the sense that we've got a nursery, but it is very much a school-based, classroom-based nursery. And for some children, that's absolutely right. We don't do wraparound care, and for some families, that's not right. So I'm pretty open-minded about that, actually, about whether coming to a school-based nursery is right for your child, whether you can manage the fact that, as I say, we don't do wraparound care, and whether that suits you, or whether actually you think that being for a second year in a nursery would actually be right. And that I completely respect the decisions that people make about that. I don't think this is this isn't a binary right nor wrong question, really.
A curious aspect of this panel is that we don't actually have a through school that goes from nursery to 18, but there are some here in the building, and it's a sort of fact of the marketplace that a lot of parents love the idea that they've done it once and they're in, and they don't have to think about it until they're 18. Whether that's a good thing is a really interesting question. I happened to go to a school that went from 8 to 18, and it was too long.
And I think I hear that from families that have done the 3 or 4 to 18, and I think for the children it can be a bit claustrophobic, and I think children need the change and maybe a bit more a difference in pace.
I mean, enmities formed at 5 can last a long time. I can tell you that for nothing. Anyway, I'd like to thank our panel very much. And just to say that you're going to be over there, aren't you, in the nursery corner? Alison, if you wanted to wander off in that direction, there's a bit of space over there. So if you want to continue the conversations with them, you can have some one-to-one conversations. If you want more of this kind of thing, we're going to be talking fees in 15 minutes. So all matters financial will be on the table at that point.